It is May 13th, 2026, and the two most powerful men on Earth sat down in a room together, not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was watching the world's most critical waterway become a permanent casualty of a war that neither of them started and neither of them can afford to finish. Donald Trump and Xi Jinping held what their respective administrations are calling an emergency summit, a meeting that was arranged in less than 36 hours, conducted without the usual diplomatic architecture of pre-negotiated communiques and carefully staged photo opportunities, and ended without a joint statement, without a press conference, and without any of the visible markers that normally signal that two heads of state have reached an agreement on anything. What they produced instead was something more ambiguous and in some ways more consequential than a formal can manage unilaterally. And that acknowledgement, that specific moment of superpower recognition, that the crisis is larger than either of their individual capacities to control, is both the most important development of the past 72 hours and the most dangerous signal that the world has received since the Strait of Hormuz was mined in late February. Let us be precise about what the Trump-Xi meeting was and what it was not, because the gap between those two things is where the real analytical work begins. This was not a peace conference. This was not a negotiating session in which the two leaders exchanged positions on the terms of a ceasefire and moved toward a compromise. This was a crisis consultation between two powers whose interests in the Persian Gulf are structurally different, whose relationships with the parties to the conflict are asymmetric, and whose domestic political constraints pull in opposite directions on virtually every question the crisis raises. Trump came to the table as the leader of a country that has 3 carrier strike groups in the water, that has already conducted strikes against Iranian naval assets, and that is under mounting domestic pressure from a political coalition that reads restraint as weakness and escalation as resolve. Xi came to the table as the leader of a country that imports roughly 40% of its oil. Through the Strait of Hormuz, that has maintained a posture of public neutrality while conducting private back-channel communications with Tehran, and that is watching its economic relationship with the Gulf states deteriorate with every week that the strait remains in its current status. These two men do not want the same thing. What they share is a common fear of what happens if nobody manages the situation at all. The meeting itself lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes, which is long by the standards of emergency diplomatic consultations, and tells you something important about the depth of the conversation that took place. American and Chinese officials who have spoken to journalists on background describe a session that moved through 3 distinct phases. The first phase was an intelligence exchange, in which both sides shared their assessments of Iranian military intentions and the operational status of IRGC assets in the Gulf. The second phase was an economic briefing, in which Chinese economic officials walked their American counterparts through the specific pressure points that prolonged strait disruption is creating in Asian supply chains, and American economic officials reciprocated with data on the inflationary effects that oil above $111 a barrel is generating in Western economies. The third phase, which reportedly lasted nearly 2 hours and produced no recorded agreement but generated what one American official described as a genuine alignment of concern, was a discussion of what a managed de-escalation pathway might look like and what role each power could play in creating the conditions for one. No pathway was agreed. No roles were assigned. But the conversation happened, and the fact that it happened at this level of seriousness and this length of duration means that both Washington and Beijing have privately concluded that the crisis is entering a phase that requires superpower coordination rather than superpower competition. Now let us talk about why that conclusion is both correct and almost certainly insufficient to prevent further escalation, because the structural problem with superpower coordination in this crisis is that the party whose decisions will determine whether the ceasefire holds or collapses is not the party sitting at the Trump-Xi table. Iran is the pivot point of this entire situation. Iran is the actor whose military alert level, whose IRGC, internal politics, whose economic collapse timeline, and whose negotiating posture will determine whether the next 72 hours produce a breakthrough or a catastrophe. And Iran is the one major party to this crisis that neither Trump nor Xi can directly compel, instruct, or reliably predict. The United States has enormous military leverage over Iran, as 3 carrier strike groups and a demonstrated willingness to use them makes clear. But military leverage is not the same as political control over another government's internal decision-making process. You can destroy infrastructure. You can sink vessels. You can degrade operational capacity. What you cannot do with carrier groups is reach inside the IRGC's military council and change the political calculation that is driving the decisions being made there. China has economic leverage over Iran that is different in character, but similarly limited in its practical application to the specific decision point Iran currently faces. Beijing is Tehran's largest trading partner. Chinese energy companies have continued to purchase Iranian oil at discounted rates throughout the period of Western sanctions. The economic lifeline that China has provided to Iran over the past several years is real and it matters. But that lifeline has not purchased Beijing the kind of decisive influence over Iranian strategic decision-making that would allow Xi Jinping to pick up the phone, call Tehran, and deliver a message that changes the IRGC's military posture. The Iran dimension of this crisis has developed several features in the past 48 hours that deserve specific analytical attention because they are changing the risk calculus in ways that are not fully visible in the public reporting. The IRGC's high alert status, which we discussed in detail in our previous analysis, has now been maintained for more than 72 hours. This is significant for reasons that go beyond the simple fact of the alert's existence. 72 hours is approximately the point at which high alert status begins to impose measurable operational strain on the forces involved. Personnel fatigue accumulates. Equipment that has been held at peak readiness requires maintenance cycles that are incompatible with sustained alert posture. Logistical systems that were designed for surge operations begin to show the stress of extended. Converging simultaneously represents a qualitatively different level of stress than anything the system has previously been asked to absorb in a compressed time frame. And the economic officials who are delivering these assessments to Pezeshkian are doing so with the explicit understanding that the president does not have the authority to act on them, because the people who do have that authority are the same people whose political logic is pushing toward continued confrontation. Let us now examine the specific question of what China's role in this crisis actually is, and what it could potentially become, because the Trump-Xi meeting has elevated Beijing from a background actor to a front stage participant, and understanding what China can and cannot do changes the map of possible outcomes significantly. China's interests in the Persian Gulf are enormous, and they are not aligned with the continuation of the current crisis. 40% of Chinese oil imports transit through Hormuz. Chinese infrastructure investments across the Gulf states, including in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Oman, are valued at hundreds of billions of dollars and are generating returns that depend on regional stability. The Belt and road connectivity projects that Beijing has spent a decade building across the Middle East and South Asia are being systematically disrupted by the current crisis in ways that Chinese economic planners describe as a strategic setback of the first order. China does not want this war. China has not wanted this war since before it started. What China has wanted is to maintain sufficient strategic ambiguity about its position that it could continue its economic relationships with all parties simultaneously. That ambiguity has now been partially collapsed by the reality of the crisis and by the decision to participate in the emergency summit with Trump. Beijing has moved from the position of interested neutral to the opportunity is that China's unique combination of economic relationships with Iran, diplomatic relationships with Gulf states, and superpower status gives it a potential mediating role that no other actor in the current crisis possesses. The United States cannot credibly offer Iran a face-saving exit because American domestic politics requires that any Iranian concession be visible and humiliating enough to look like a win for the administration. Russia has the will to help Iran, but lacks the economic leverage and the diplomatic credibility in Western capitals that a mediated settlement would require. The Gulf states have the most direct economic stake in resolution, but lack the political weight to bring Iran to the table on terms Tehran would accept. China has relationships with all of these actors and interests that align with resolution rather than prolongation. If there is a diplomatic pathway out of this crisis, it almost certainly runs through Beijing in ways that neither American nor Iranian officials are currently willing to acknowledge publicly, but that both are privately exploring. The risk is that by participating in the Trump-Xi meeting, Beijing has partially forfeited the neutrality that gave it access to Tehran. Iranian officials are already signaling privately that they view Chinese participation in a joint summit with Washington as a form of alignment with American pressure. And that signal, if it hardens, into a formal Iranian assessment that China has joined the coalition against it, would remove the most promising remaining channel for managed. The Strait of Hormuz situation has developed a specific complication in the past 48 hours that the Trump-Xi meeting addressed directly, and that represents one of the few areas where the two powers have reached something approaching a shared operational framework. The mine-clearing problem, which we identified in our previous analysis as the single most consequential physical obstacle to any ceasefire implementation, has now been formally acknowledged by both American and Chinese military officials as requiring a multilateral naval operation that cannot be conducted by any single power acting alone. American minesweeping capability in the Gulf is significant but not sufficient for the scale of the clearance. Operation that full, straight reopening would require. Chinese naval assets in the region, which have been present as part of Beijing's long-standing anti-piracy mission and have recently been augmented in response to the crisis, include minesweeping capabilities that would complement American assets. The idea of a joint American-Chinese naval mine clearance operation in the Strait of Hormuz would have been categorically unthinkable 18 months ago. The fact that it is now being discussed at the level of the Trump-Xi summit as a potential element of a ceasefire implementation framework tells you something important about how far the crisis has shifted the baseline of what is operationally and politically conceivable. But a joint mine clearance operation requires a ceasefire first, and a ceasefire requires an agreement. And an agreement requires a negotiating process that can produce terms that both the American domestic political environment and the IRGC's internal political environment can absorb, without triggering the collapse of the governments involved. That is the sequence. And right now the sequence is broken at the second link because the negotiating architecture that exists is not capable of producing an agreement that the people who actually control Iran's military posture will implement. This is the core problem that the Trump-Xi meeting identified, but did not solve. Both leaders understand that the diplomatic channel through Pakistan and Oman is producing conversations rather than agreements. Both leaders understand that the IRGC's relationship to the foreign ministry channel means that anything Araghchi agrees to in the back channel is subject to IRGC veto. Both leaders discussed, according to background reporting, the possibility of creating a parallel channel that would allow direct communication with the IRGC Military Council, bypassing the Foreign Ministry entirely. That discussion did not produce a mechanism, it produced a recognition of the need for one. Recognition and mechanism are very different things in a crisis that is moving faster than the diplomatic process can keep up with. Now let us look at what the Trump administration's domestic political situation means for the crisis trajectory, because Washington's internal dynamics are constraining American options in ways that the public posture of firm resolve does not fully communicate. Trump came into the summit with Xi carrying the weight of a domestic political coalition whose primary metric of success in this crisis is Iranian capitulation that is visible and attributable to American military pressure. The strikes against Iranian naval assets, the carrier group deployments, the sanctions acceleration, all of these have been sold to the American political base as evidence that the maximum pressure strategy is working and that Iran is being forced toward terms it would not otherwise accept. That framing creates a political constraint on the kinds of concessions that Trump can offer in any negotiated settlement without triggering a domestic political backlash from the very coalition that has supported his handling of the crisis. You cannot publicly describe a settlement as a mutual compromise if you have spent months describing your approach as producing unconditional Iranian accommodation. The gap between what a durable settlement would actually require and what the American domestic political environment will allow to be described as a settlement is one of the least discussed but most consequential constraints on the resolution of this crisis. Xi understood this constraint going into the meeting and reportedly spent considerable time in the second and third phases of the discussion, exploring what the American side would need in terms of visible Iranian concessions to be able to present a deal as a win to its domestic audience. That exploration has not yet produced an answer that maps onto what the Iranian side, even the parts of the Iranian side that want de-escalation, could deliver without triggering its own internal political collapse. The broader international dimension of the Trump-Xi meeting deserves specific attention because the reaction to the summit from third parties tells you something important about how the rest of the world is reading the crisis and what their expectations are for its resolution. European governments, which have been largely sidelined from the active crisis management conversation, despite having enormous economic stakes in the outcome, have responded to the Trump-Xi summit with a mixture of relief that superpower communication is happening and anxiety about being excluded from a framework that will determine outcomes affecting their economies and their security. The European Union's foreign policy apparatus has been attempting to insert itself into the diplomatic process through the Oman Channel, but has found that both Washington and Beijing are treating this as a bilateral crisis management exercise in which European participation would complicate rather than facilitate resolution. That assessment may be correct as a matter of operational diplomacy. It is not correct as a matter of long-term legitimacy, and the Europeans understand this, which is why French and German officials have been making increasingly pointed public statements about the need for a multilateral framework. Gulf states, whose oil production and territorial security are directly implicated in the crisis, are watching the Trump-Xi dynamic with the specific concern that a superpower deal will be struck that addresses American and Chinese interests without adequately protecting Gulf state interests. Saudi Arabia and The UAE have both communicated privately to Washington that their cooperation on any post-ceasefire framework depends on their interests being represented in whatever architecture emerges from the superpower consultation. India, which has its own enormous exposure to Gulf oil and its own complex relationships with both Iran and the United States, is conducting parallel diplomatic outreach that does not fit neatly into either the American or the Chinese framework, and that may ultimately produce an independent Indian contribution to the resolution pathway that nobody is. Here is what the 72 hours following the Trump-Xi summit actually look like, from an analytical standpoint that takes seriously the full complexity of what has just occurred. The summit has not resolved the crisis. It has not produced a ceasefire mechanism, a negotiating framework, or a shared operational plan for straight reopening. What it has produced is a shared superpower recognition that the crisis requires managed resolution rather than continued competitive escalation management, and a preliminary discussion of what Chinese involvement in a resolution pathway might look like. That is not nothing. In a crisis of this complexity and this danger, a shared recognition between Washington and Beijing that they need to work together rather than against each other is a meaningful shift in the operational environment. But it is also not sufficient. The gap between recognizing the need for a solution and actually producing one is enormous. The forces that are working against resolution have not weakened as a result of the summit. The IRGC's internal political logic has not changed. The Iranian economic clock has not slowed. The American domestic political constraints have not loosened. The mine problem in the Strait has not been solved. The negotiating architecture has not been repaired. Every structural obstacle to resolution that existed before Trump and Xi sat down together still exists after they stood up and walked out. What has changed is the constellation of actors who are now actively engaged in trying to address those obstacles and the level at which that engagement is occurring. Watch the Chinese diplomatic channels to Tehran in the coming hours. Beijing will make contact with Iranian officials at the highest level it can access, which may or may not include the IRGC military council, depending on the state of those relationships. Watch whether that contact produces any visible change in Iranian public statements on the ceasefire or on the negotiating process. Watch the IRGC naval asset positioning in the Gulf, because the operational clock on high alert status is running and a decision about whether to stand down or escalate is approaching. Watch the American domestic political reaction to the Trump-Xi summit. Because the way that reaction develops will shape how much flexibility Trump has in the next phase of negotiations. Watch the Omani and Pakistani diplomatic channels for any change in the substantive terms being discussed, because those channels are still the primary conduit through which any Iranian de-escalation signal would travel to Washington. And watch the Iranian domestic economic indicators, because the pressure compressing from that direction is now the most powerful force pushing toward a decision that the IRGC's internal political logic is still resisting. Here's the bottom line on the Trump-Xi emergency meeting, and what it means for the trajectory of the crisis. The world's two most powerful leaders sat in a room together for more than 4 hours, because the situation in the Persian Gulf has become dangerous enough that they could no longer manage their respective positions in parallel without coordinating their crisis management approaches. That coordination is now beginning. It is incomplete. It is contested internally on both sides. It has not yet produced the specific mechanism that would allow a ceasefire to be converted into a durable political settlement, and it has not yet addressed the fundamental problem of who speaks with binding authority for Iran's military decisions. But it is happening. And the fact that it is happening at the level of heads of state in real time, with the full engagement of both sides' intelligence and military establishments, means that the probability of the crisis resolving through managed diplomacy rather than through uncontrolled escalation has increased in the past 24 hours, even if only marginally. Marginally matters when the margins are as thin as they are right now. The ceasefire thread is still thin. The IRGC alert is still active. The mines are still in the water. The economic clock is still running. But there are now two superpower governments whose leaders have personally committed to working together on the problem. And that is a different world than the one that existed before the 11-minute phone call and the 4-hour summit that followed it. Whether it is a different enough world to prevent what the next 72 hours could bring is the question that nobody in Washington, Beijing, or Tehran can answer tonight. And the honest answer is that nobody will know until the hours themselves have passed.